Sit back. Let your thoughts grow quiet. The night outside is long, and the air is heavy. You are safe here, but centuries ago, the night was never safe. The Middle Ages are remembered for castles and cathedrals, for kings and knights, for the great sweep of history told in battles and dynasties. But in the shadows of all that glory, life was fragile, uncertain, and short. The roads were dark, the streets unlit, and no guards patrolled the countryside. To step outside after sunset was to walk into danger, and it was in that darkness, in that silence, that the most dangerous creatures of all moved unseen. Not beasts, not demons, not phantoms of folklore, but people, men and women whose cruelty, cunning, or madness turned them into something far worse than the wolves in the woods or the bandits on the road. People who killed not once, not twice, but again and again. Today we call them serial killers. In the Middle Ages they had no such name. Instead, they became legends, monsters, or whispers spoken by firelight. Their crimes were recorded in chronicles, exaggerated by rumor, and painted with the colors of superstition. Some of them lived in castles, wrapped in velvet and power. Others hid in villages, blending with the poor. A few became stories so twisted by myth that we can no longer tell where fact ends and fantasy begins. And yet, behind every tale, behind every horror, there was always a body, always blood, always loss. Tonight we walk into that world, slowly, softly, into the alleys, the fields, and the courts of medieval Europe. Into the places where fear took shape in human form. This is not a story of knights or kings. This is the story of killers. To understand why serial killers thrived in the Middle Ages, you must first understand the world they walked in. Imagine the night in a medieval village. There are no street lamps, no glowing windows, no hum of electricity. When the sun falls, darkness comes absolute. Only the moon and the stars light your way, and clouds may swallow even those. If you walked from one village to the next, you would follow rutted paths carved by the hooves of oxen and the wheels of carts. In rain, the path became mud. In winter ice, if you carried a lantern, it lit only a few steps ahead and made you more visible to anyone waiting in the dark. And always, there were sounds. The creak of trees, the howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through tall grass. Or sometimes, nothing at all. Silence so deep it seemed alive. Bandits were common, and travelers feared them. But worse still were those who did not kill for hunger or for gold. The ones who killed because they wanted to. Medieval people believed in demons, witches, and werewolves. When cattle were found slaughtered, when children went missing, when bodies were discovered in fields, the explanation was often supernatural. But sometimes the truth was darker. For without police, without forensic science, without even the idea of serial murder, there was little to stop them. If a peasant went missing, perhaps they had run away. If a beggar was found dead, perhaps they had frozen in the cold. If a child vanished, perhaps the wolves had taken it. And so killers could move freely. Cloaked in the shadows of ignorance and fear, they walked unnoticed. In towns, the picture was little better. Streets were narrow, twisted, unlit. Buildings leaned overhead, casting deep shadows. Night soil ran in the gutters. A scream in the dark might go unanswered, drowned by the noise of taverns or ignored by neighbors who had long learned not to involve themselves. Even in daylight, fear lingered. The law was harsh but uneven. Nobles could escape justice with a bribe. Clergy were shielded by holy orders. And peasants had no voice at all. It was a world where power meant freedom, and freedom could mean death for those beneath it. This was the stage, the dark road, the crooked alley, the silent chamber, and upon this stage, killers walked. Some became infamous, remembered in chronicles. Others slipped into legend, transformed into monsters of folklore. A few were never caught, their names lost, their crimes remembered only as whispers of the devil's work. And yet all of them were real. The Middle Ages did not invent cruelty, but they gave it fertile ground. And so, when you hear of knights and kings, of crowns and crusades, remember also the shadows at the edge of the fire. Remember the faces unseen in the crowd. For in the Middle Ages, even as the church bells rang and the markets bustled, there were always killers waiting in the dark. In the chronicles of medieval France, few names carry as much weight, as much dread, as Gilles de Rais. He was not born a shadow in the night, nor a beggar in the gutter. He was born into nobility, wrapped in wealth and privilege. Once, he stood at the side of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. He fought for France, raised banners against the English, and was hailed as a hero. His courage was sung in the streets. His name carried honor. But when war ended, when glory faded, Gilles de Rais turned inward. And what he became was something far darker than any enemy soldier. They said he lured children. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. He promised food, work, or safety. And when they entered his halls, they never left. His castle became a place of whispers, where the laughter of children was heard one day and silence the next. The crimes were monstrous, bodies found dismembered, bones buried in hidden corners, servants who testified in horror at what they had seen. Some said he turned murder into ritual. Others said it was lust, cruelty, or madness. Historians argue still, was Gilles de Rais truly the monster described? Or was his fall partly political, his trial shaped by greed for his lands and fortune? But beneath the layers of myth and rumor, the evidence is heavy. The testimonies, though taken under fear, speak of a nobleman whose hunger for blood consumed him. What makes Gilles de Rais so haunting is the contrast. A knight who once stood beside a saint, who raised his sword for faith and crown, became a butcher of children. And in the Middle Ages, this contradiction blurred the line between man and demon. People believed the devil himself had claimed him, that his crimes were not human, but infernal. His trial was not only about murder, it was about witchcraft, heresy, and pacts with hell. In 1440, the court condemned him. He was hanged and burned in Nantes, his wealth scattered, his name forever cursed. But his story lingered. Parents spoke his name to frighten their children. Priests preached his fall as a warning against pride and sin. And in time, Gilles de Rais slipped from history into legend. Some said he was the inspiration for the fairy tale of Bluebeard, the nobleman who killed his wives and hid their bodies, a children's story born from the shadow of a man who had slaughtered children. And so Gilles de Rais stands as a reminder, not all killers lurked in the woods or hid in alleys. Some wore armor, rode with saints, and lived in castles. Some were celebrated before they were feared. In the end, his name is not only a tale of horror. It is a lesson in the fragility of human honor, that even those raised highest may fall into the darkest depths. And when you close your eyes, remember, the Middle Ages were not only haunted by witches and wolves. Sometimes, the true monsters were men dressed as knights. And when you close your eyes, remember the Middle Ages were not only haunted by witches and wolves. Sometimes, the true monsters were men dressed as knights. But what made Gilles de Rais so terrifying was not only his cruelty. It was the betrayal of expectation. In a world built on order, where peasants were meant to toil, priests to pray, and knights to protect, he broke the very fabric of trust. If a beggar murdered, it was tragedy. If a soldier killed without cause, it was dishonor. But when a knight, sworn to God and country, turned his blade against the most helpless of all, it was blasphemy. For the peasants who whispered his name, Gilles de Rais was not only a murderer, he was proof that no station, no oath, no title was safe from corruption. He became a symbol of fear that stretched far beyond his castle walls. The chronicles tell us that parents clutched their children tighter, not only when traveling the road, but even when they heard the bells ring for Mass. For if a man who had once ridden beside Joan of Arc could fall, then anyone could. And this, perhaps, is why his story endured. The Middle Ages were a time of belief. Demons, angels, saints, witches, all were real to those who walked the muddy streets and knelt in candlelit chapels. And so, when news of Gilles de Rais spread, people did not see him as simply a man who killed. They saw him as possessed, claimed by hell itself. In the marketplace, his name was spoken in hushed tones, his sins expanded by rumor. Some said he drank blood. Some said he called upon demons in candlelit chambers. Some swore his castle reeked of sulfur, as though hell's gates had opened within it. Whether these tales were truth or fear hardly mattered. In the minds of medieval villagers, he had become more than human. He was a monster in noble flesh. And so the story of Gilles de Rais became a shadow cast across generations. Even when his bones turned to dust, the tale remained. For in every age, people search for monsters. And in the Middle Ages, it was easy to believe they walked not only in forests and caves, but also in castles, wrapped in silk, carrying banners that once promised protection. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of his fall. Not that evil hides in darkness, but that it can thrive in light. Not that killers walk only in shadow, but that sometimes they stand in the open, praised and celebrated, until the truth finally drags them down. And as the fire consumed him in Nantes, the crowd saw not a knight, not a nobleman, not a hero of France. They saw the monster they had feared, a reminder carved into smoke and ash. The Middle Ages would go on. New wars, new kings, new plagues. But the story of Gilles de Rais lingered like a scar, proof that no one, not even the highest among men, was beyond becoming a killer. In the late 16th century, in a small village near Cologne, Germany, fear took on a new name. His name was Peter Stump, though to the villagers, he was not merely a man. He was the werewolf of Bedburg. The story begins, as so many do, with bodies. Farmers found cattle torn apart, their throats ripped open, their entrails scattered across the fields. Soon after, villagers vanished. Men, women, and children disappearing on their way home from market, or from prayers at the chapel. What was left behind was horror bones gnawed clean, flesh torn as though by claws. The people of Bedburg whispered of wolves. Packs roamed the forests, and a hungry winter could drive them close to human dwellings. But these deaths seemed different. Too many, too brutal, too deliberate, and so suspicion turned, as it so often did, from beast to man. Peter Stump was a farmer, by all accounts unremarkable. He tilled the soil, raised his family, and lived as others did. But whispers grew. They said he owned a belt, not of leather or cloth, but of sorcery. A belt given by the devil himself, which allowed him to transform into a wolf. When he strapped it on, his body stretched, his hands became claws, his teeth sharpened, and his hunger knew no limit. At night, they said, he roamed the fields as a beast. He fell upon travelers, dragged children into the woods, and feasted on their flesh. When he was finally captured in 1589, The trial that followed became one of the most infamous in medieval Europe. The accusations were staggering. They claimed he had murdered and eaten at least 13 children, that he had devoured livestock and attacked pregnant women, tearing the unborn from their wombs, that he had even turned against his own family in fits of bloodlust. In court, under the torment of torture, Stump confessed. He admitted to wearing the devil's belt, to transforming into a wolf, to committing horrors too gruesome for even the executioners to speak aloud. The sentence was swift and merciless. On October 31, 1589, Peter Stump was executed in Bedburg. He was broken on the wheel, his limbs shattered with iron. His head was struck from his shoulders, and his body, alongside the bodies of his daughter and mistress, was burned to ash. To mark the place, the villagers erected a pole with a spiked wheel and a wolf's head, a warning to all who might follow the path of the devil. But the story of Peter Stump did not end with his death. For centuries, his tale was retold, sometimes as fact, sometimes as legend. Was he truly a murderer who hid his crimes behind superstition? Or was he the victim of hysteria, scapegoated by a community desperate for answers? Some historians suggest his confessions were forced under unbearable torture, his crimes exaggerated or invented by officials seeking to terrify the people into obedience. Others argue that the sheer number of deaths attributed to him speaks to a real and terrible hunger that consumed the man. Whatever the truth, the legend of the werewolf of Bedburg lives on. He became one of the earliest recorded werewolf trials, blending crime with folklore, murder with myth. And in this blending lies the terror of the tale. For whether Peter Stump was a madman, a murderer, or an innocent man broken by torture, he was remembered not as himself, but as a monster. A werewolf, proof to his neighbors that the devil walked among them in human skin. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance were full of such stories. People did not speak of serial killers. The concept did not yet exist. Instead, they spoke of witches, demons, and beasts. When patterns of murder appeared, they explained them not with psychology or pathology, but with sorcery and Satan, and perhaps that made the terror even deeper. For to live in Bedburg in 1589 was to believe that your neighbor might not be merely cruel, or greedy, or violent. It was to believe that he might shed his skin at night, that he might walk as a beast, that no fence or door could protect you from his hunger. So when the fires burned, when the ashes of Peter Stump were carried away by the wind, the people of Bedburg did not feel justice. They felt survival. And in the silence that followed, they still watched the woods, still listened for howls in the night. For even in death, the werewolf of Bedburg continued to haunt them. And when you close your eyes tonight, drifting between sleep and shadow, remember this: the monsters of medieval Europe were not always wolves, nor demons, nor phantoms. Sometimes they were men who walked in daylight, carrying secrets darker than the forest night. And when you close your eyes tonight, drifting between sleep and shadow, remember this: the monsters of medieval Europe were not always wolves, nor demons, nor phantoms. Sometimes they were men who walked in daylight, carrying secrets darker than the forest night. And that was what made them so terrifying. You could avoid the forest. You could pray for protection against the devil. You could lock your doors against bandits. But how could you guard yourself against a neighbor? Against the man who shared your market stall, who greeted you on the road, who broke bread at your table. That was the lesson of Bedburg. Peter Stump was not a stranger in a black cloak. He was not a hermit in the woods. He was a farmer, a villager, a man who looked like everyone else. By daylight he plowed the soil, tended animals, and lived the life of a peasant. By night, they said, he hunted. And that duality, the familiar face hiding the unimaginable, lingered long after his ashes were scattered. For the peasants of Bedburg, safety became an illusion. If a man could wear the mask of normality while harboring such hunger, then anyone could. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss his story as legend, to see the werewolf trial as a relic of superstition. But for those who lived through it, who lost children and cattle and kin, the horror was real. Whether Stump was a murderer or merely a scapegoat, his name became a vessel for their fear. He embodied the darkness they could not explain. And that, perhaps, is the true mark of a killer in the medieval world. Not the bodies alone, not the blood or the crime, but the shadow that stretched from it. A shadow that fell across an entire village, changing how they looked at each other, how they trusted, how they slept at night. For the people of Bedburg, the monster was gone. But the fear remained. The silence of the woods grew heavier, the sound of a howl more dangerous, the look of a neighbor more suspicious. And so, even after the trial ended, the story went on. The fire that consumed Peter Stump was meant to end his terror. But like all fires, it cast smoke, and smoke drifts. It drifts into memory, into legend, into the pages of history. And from there, it finds its way to us centuries later. And so we remember, not because we believe in werewolves, not because we think of belts woven by the devil, but because his story, like Gilles de Rais before him, reminds us that the monsters of the past were not distant, not strange, not supernatural. They were human. And that is always the hardest truth to face. Alongside the bodies of his daughter and mistress, was burned to ash. To mark the place, the villagers erected a pole with a spiked wheel and a wolf's head, a warning to all who might follow the path of the devil. But the story of Peter Stump did not end with his death. For centuries, his tale was retold. Sometimes as fact, sometimes as legend. Was he truly a murderer who hid his crimes behind superstition? Or was he the victim of hysteria, scapegoated by a community desperate for answers? Some historians suggest his confessions were forced under unbearable torture. His crimes exaggerated or invented by officials seeking to terrify the people into obedience. Others argue that the sheer number of deaths attributed to him speaks to a real and terrible hunger that consumed the man. Whatever the truth, the legend of the werewolf of Bedburg lives on. He became one of the earliest recorded werewolf trials, blending crime with folklore, murder with myth, and in this blending lies the terror of the tale. For whether Peter Stump was a madman, a murderer, or an innocent man broken by torture, he was remembered not as himself, but as a monster, a werewolf, proof to his neighbors that the devil walked among them in human skin. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance were full of such stories. People did not speak of serial killers. The concept did not yet exist. Instead, they spoke of witches, demons, and beasts. When patterns of murder appeared, they explained them not with psychology or pathology, but with sorcery and Satan, and perhaps that made the terror even deeper. For to live in Bedburg in 1589 was to believe that your neighbor might not be merely cruel, or greedy, or violent. It was to believe that he might shed his skin at night, that he might walk as a beast, that no fence or door could protect you from his hunger. So when the fires burned, when the ashes of Peter Stump were carried away by the wind, the people of Bedburg did not feel justice. They felt survival, and in the silence that followed, they still watched the woods. still listened for howls in the night. For even in death, the werewolf of Bedburg continued to haunt them. And when you close your eyes tonight, drifting between sleep and shadow, remember this: the monsters of medieval Europe were not always wolves, nor demons, nor phantoms. Sometimes they were men who walked in daylight, carrying secrets darker than the forest night. And when you close your eyes tonight, drifting between sleep and shadow, remember this: the monsters of medieval Europe were not always wolves, nor demons, nor phantoms. Sometimes they were men who walked in daylight, carrying secrets darker than the forest night. And that was what made them so terrifying. You could avoid the forest. You could pray for protection against the devil. You could lock your doors against bandits. But how could you guard yourself against a neighbor? Against the man who shared your market stall, who greeted you on the road, who broke bread at your table? That was the lesson of Bedburg. Peter Stump was not a stranger in a black cloak. He was not a hermit in the woods. He was a farmer, a villager, a man who looked like everyone else. By daylight he plowed the soil, tended animals, and lived the life of a peasant. By night, they said, he hunted. And that duality, the familiar face hiding the unimaginable, lingered long after his ashes were scattered. For the peasants of Bedburg, safety became an illusion. If a man could wear the mask of normality while harboring such hunger, then anyone could. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss his story as legend, to see the werewolf trial as a relic of superstition. But for those who lived through it, who lost children and cattle and kin, the horror was real. Whether Stump was a murderer or merely a scapegoat, his name became a vessel for their fear. He embodied the darkness they could not explain. And that, perhaps, is the true mark of a killer in the medieval world. Not the bodies alone, not the blood or the crime, but the shadow that stretched from it. A shadow that fell across an entire village, changing how they looked at each other, how they trusted, how they slept at night. For the people of Bedburg, the monster was gone, but the fear remained. The silence of the woods grew heavier, the sound of a howl more dangerous, the look of a neighbor more suspicious. And so, even after the trial ended, the story went on. The fire that consumed Peter Stump was meant to end his terror. But like all fires, it casts smoke. And smoke drifts. It drifts into memory, into legend, into the pages of history. And from there it finds its way to us centuries later. And so we remember. Not because we believe in werewolves. Not because we think of belts woven by the devil. But because his story, like Gilles de Rais before him, reminds us that the monsters of the past were not distant, not strange, not supernatural. They were human. And that is always the hardest truth to face. And so the Blood Countess slipped from history into legend. She became a warning told across Europe, a shadow cast across centuries. The tale grew in retelling, each generation adding new horrors, until she was less a woman and more a phantom. But in the silence behind those myths, the truth lingers still. That in the Middle Ages, power was often shield enough. That the voices of peasants, crying for their daughters, went unheard until the scandal touched the ears of nobles and kings. That justice was not born from pity, but from politics. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all, that her crimes were not stopped because of their horror, but because they became inconvenient. In the end, Elizabeth B. Thory was not remembered as a noblewoman, not as a wife or mother, not even as a prisoner bricked into her castle. She was remembered as something else entirely, a monster woven into the fabric of folklore, her name forever bound to blood. and long after her bones turn to dust, her legend still whispers at the gates of history, reminding us that safety is never guaranteed, not even behind the strongest walls. In the shadows of medieval Europe, death did not always come with a blade or a scream in the night. Sometimes it came quietly, unnoticed, carried in a cup of wine or a loaf of bread. Sometimes the deadliest killers of the Middle Ages left no trace but silence, for their weapon was poison. Unlike the bloody crimes of Gilles de Rais or the monstrous legends of Peter Stump and Elizabeth B. Thory, the poisoners thrived in secrecy. They did not kill with spectacle. They killed with patience, with calculation, with subtlety. And for that reason, their names often blurred into rumor, their deeds whispered rather than recorded. But in Italy, in France, in the courts of kings and the cottages of peasants, their shadow stretched wide. One of the most infamous names to linger through history is that of Aqua Tofana. It was not the name of a woman, but of a poison, a clear, tasteless liquid said to have been created by a woman named Giulia Tofana in 17th century Italy. Though later than the medieval age, the legend of Aqua Tofana grew from older traditions, when women had long turned to herbs, powders, and draughts to rid themselves of cruel husbands or dangerous rivals. The stories say Aqua Tofana could be mixed into wine or food without detection. A few drops, and death would follow, not instantly, but slowly, mimicking illness. A cough, a fever, a wasting of the body. Doctors would call it sickness. Priests would call it fate, and no one would suspect the hand that delivered the cup. It is said that hundreds died by its touch. That noblewomen, trapped in marriages arranged without their will, sought it as a tool of freedom. That peasants, desperate for revenge or survival, whispered its name as salvation. To the authorities, it was nothing less than sorcery. To those who used it, it was a secret weapon in a world where power belonged only to men. But Aqua Tofana was not alone. Across Europe, chronicles speak of other poisoners. Women accused of brewing deadly potions from herbs gathered in the woods. Hemlock, belladonna, wolfsbane. Some were midwives, some healers, some wives who had learned too much of plants. In France, tales spread of women who slipped arsenic into stews. In the German states, whispers told of draughts made from mushrooms and toadskins, and in every case, fear followed. For poison was unlike any other form of murder. It was invisible. It was undetectable. It needed no sword, no strength, no midnight attack. It could be delivered with a smile. And so, the figure of the poisoner became one of the most feared in medieval imagination. To share a meal was no longer safe. To drink wine at a feast was to trust not only the cook, but every hand that had touched the cup. In time, the fear grew into paranoia. Women who knew too much of herbs were branded witches. Healers who cured illness could as easily cause it. And in an age when justice was swift and merciless, the line between healer and killer often vanished altogether. The truth, as always, is tangled. Were these women truly mass murderers, hidden serial killers who used their knowledge for death? Or were they convenient scapegoats, condemned by rumor, by jealous rivals, by frightened husbands who feared their independence? The chronicles do not give clear answers. Some speak of trials, of confessions wrung by torture, of bodies exhumed with suspicion. Others speak only of legends, passed from mouth to mouth until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. But what cannot be denied is the fear they inspired, for in a world of swords and arrows, of wolves and fire, the most terrifying killer was the one you could not see, the one who offered you bread with a smile, the one whose hand trembled not with violence, but with patience, and so the poisoner remains a shadow in medieval history. Less visible than the knight who killed in bloodlust, less infamous than the noblewoman who bathed in gore, but in some ways more terrifying. Because to live in those times was to live with hunger, with sickness, with uncertainty. And when death came quietly, creeping into the body like a sickness, who could ever say it was murder? Perhaps that is why their legend remains. Because poisoners remind us of a truth too easy to forget, that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers in silence, and in the Middle Ages, silence was often the deadliest sound of all. It was the silence of a cup placed on the table, steam curling from its rim. The silence of bread broken and passed from hand to hand. The silence of a host smiling as his guest raised the wine to his lips. No screams, no clash of steel, no howl in the night. Only the soft sounds of daily life, unbroken until the poison began its work. And even then, the sound was not violence, but weakness, the quiet rasp of breath, the faint cough that grew worse by the day, the heavy stillness of a body fading. To those who lived in the Middle Ages, that silence was terrifying, for death could now hide in plain sight. The dinner table, once a place of comfort, could become a stage of doom. A wife could end her husband with the herbs she crushed for his supper. A servant could slip powder into the owl. A neighbor could deliver honey laced with death. And the victim would never know until it was too late. That was why poisoners became legends. Not because of the numbers they killed, not even because of the cruelty of their deeds, but because they transformed the familiar into the fatal, because they showed that trust itself could be weaponized. And in a world where community meant survival, that was the most frightening betrayal of all. So the chronicles whispered of them. So the priests thundered against them. So the villagers feared them. And whether they were real or imagined, their shadows spread wide. The silence they left behind was deeper than any scream. For screams fade, but silence lingers. And long after the bodies were buried, long after the sickness was named, people remembered. They remembered the way the victim's hands trembled on the cup, the way their eyes grew hollow, the way the priest gave the last rites to a body that had never known the truth, and they remembered the silence of the one who watched. The poisoner, the killer who did not need the night, or the forest, or the mask of a beast. Only a smile, only patience, only silence. That was enough. Not every killer of the Middle Ages wore velvet or silk. Not every monster hid in castles or cloaked themselves in ritual. Many of them waited where the land was emptiest, where the roads grew dark, where the only sound was the creak of a cart and the soft thud of wary hooves. The roads of medieval Europe were lifelines. They carried grain and wool, wine and salt. They carried peasants to market, pilgrims to shrines, messengers between kings. But they were also dangerous. There were no patrols, no lamps, no lawmen pacing the ditches. Once you left the gates of a town, you entered no man's land. Forests loomed close. The air grew colder, and at every bend, there might be eyes watching from the shadows. Bandits were common. They robbed for coin, for food, for survival. But among them were those who did not kill from desperation, but from hunger of another kind. These were the highway killers. Men who struck not for bread, but for blood. Some worked alone, slipping from trees to strike down travelers before melting back into the night. Others formed gangs, rough companies that haunted entire valleys, extorting merchants, slaughtering pilgrims, vanishing before justice could find them. The chronicles tell us of men like Fulk Fitzwarren an outlawed noble turned bandit in England, whose legend blurred into ballad, or Eustace the monk, a pirate and highwayman, who was said to use black magic as easily as steel. But beyond the songs and stories, there were countless nameless killers who left no trace but fear on the roads. A merchant might leave Paris with goods and never arrive in Lyon. A pilgrim might walk toward Compostela and vanish in the Pyrenees. Their absence was explained by wolves, by illness, by misfortune. But sometimes their bones were later found in shallow graves, their bodies stripped bare, their throats cut clean. For the poor peasant, the fear was deeper still. To travel at all was to risk everything. And when the night fell, when the ditches grew black, the choice was grim: to sleep in the open and risk the killer's blade, or to stumble on, in exhaustion, praying for the lights of a village that might never come. These killers rarely became legends. They were too many, too scattered, their names swallowed by time. But their shadow hung over every road. The medieval mind was quick to give them other faces: werewolves, demons, goblins in the hedgerows. But the truth was simpler and darker. They were men, hungry for violence, cloaked in the freedom of lawless roads. And what made them so feared was not only their cruelty, but their invisibility. You could not know which bend in the road held a murderer. You could not know which shadow hid eyes watching, and so every journey became a prayer. Perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this: many of them were never caught. They struck, they killed, they vanished. No trial, no burning, no legend, only silence. And so the highways of medieval Europe became more than roads. They became hunting grounds, and every traveler, no matter how rich or poor, walked them knowing that the next corner could be their last. For in the Middle Ages, danger did not only dwell in castles or in courts. It lay in the dirt roads beneath your feet, and the killers who haunted them left no songs, no fairy tales, no myths, only bones and silence, and fear that stretched across centuries. Not every killer of the Middle Ages left behind bones or testimony. Some left only whispers, stories passed from mouth to mouth, until fact dissolved into fear, until memory became myth. These were the killers who walked the line between history and legend, men and women whose crimes, real or imagined, became so entangled with superstition that the truth will never fully be known. One of the most enduring figures in this shadowed gallery is the werewolf killer. Across France, Germany, and the Slavic lands, stories spread of men who transformed under the moon, tearing apart sheep, cattle, and sometimes children. But beneath these tales of fur and fang, there are traces of something called a more human real men accused of serial murder. In 1521, in the French region of Poligny, two men, Pierre Bergot and Michel Verdun, were tried for lycanthropy. They confessed, under torture, to having made a pact with the devil, to transforming into wolves, to attacking travelers and devouring children. Were they truly killers, or merely victims of hysteria? The chronicles do not say. But the bodies were real, the fear was real, and the legend endured. Elsewhere, in the German lands, the werewolf of Ansbach haunted the 17th century. After a series of child murders, the killer was said to take the shape of a wolf. When the villagers finally caught and executed a man accused of the crimes, they dressed a wolf's carcass in human clothing, mounting it in the marketplace as proof of their victory. The man's name is forgotten, the werewolf remains. These tales remind us how easily the medieval mind turned killers into monsters. Without the concept of a serial murderer, people explained repeated killings as something supernatural. To kill again and again was too inhuman, too incomprehensible for a mere man. It had to be sorcery. It had to be the devil's work. And so killers slipped into legend. Some were men who might have been guilty. Others may have been innocents broken under torture. Their names forever stained by stories they could not escape. But not all mythical killers were cloaked in fur and shadow. Some took other forms. The child snatcher was one such figure. In German folklore, he became the Kinderschreck or Kinderfresser, a nameless man who lured children with sweets or promises and carried them away. In some towns, these stories were born from real disappearances. A child lost in the woods, drowned in a river, or taken by a stranger could become the seed of a tale. Soon, the story grew teeth and ogre, a demon, a killer who haunted the streets at dusk. Parents told these tales to keep children safe indoors. But behind the fable, there may have been real predators, their crimes remembered not in court records, but in fairy tales. Even the story of Hansel and Gretel may carry such echoes. A witch who lured children with promises of food, then fattened them for slaughter. It is easy to dismiss as a cautionary tale, but in an age when famine was common and orphans wandered the forests, how many children truly disappeared, their fate lost to the silence of trees? The truth is that the line between myth and murderer was never clear. A real killing could become a legend. A legend could be blamed for real killings, and in both cases, the fear was the same. For the villagers, huddled by firelight, it hardly mattered whether the killer was a man or a monster. What mattered was the danger. What mattered was that people died again and again, and no one could stop it. And so the myths lived on, darker than any wolf's shadow. When we look back now, we see superstition, exaggeration, folklore. But for those who lived it, the myths were not entertainment. They were explanations. They were survival. They were the only way to make sense of horrors too, great to bear in silence. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. That real killers may have vanished into legend, their names forgotten, their victims blurred into stories told to frighten children. The Middle Ages gave us castles and cathedrals, but also fairy tales filled with witches and wolves. And hidden in those tales, behind the magic and the monsters, may be the bones of the dead, the forgotten victims of killers whose crimes became myth. Fear in the Middle Ages was not an occasional visitor. It was a constant companion. It lingered in the streets, in the fields, in the forests. It sat beside the hearth and whispered in the silence between prayers. For peasants and nobles alike, life was fragile. A harvest could fail, a plague could spread, a war could sweep across the land with little warning. Death was always close, and so the mind searched for reasons, for explanations, for names to give the darkness. And when deaths repeated, when children vanished one after another, when travelers disappeared along the same road, when bodies were found with the same wounds, the fear deepened. Patterns were not explained as the work of men, but as the hand of the devil. And so serial murder, though unnamed, was felt deeply in the soul of medieval society. The weight of fear shaped communities. It changed how neighbors looked at one another. A widow who lived at the edge of the village might become the target of suspicion, her herbs and charms seen as dangerous. A beggar who appeared whenever misfortune struck might be blamed for the deaths. Even nobles, if their cruelty grew too loud to ignore, could find their names whispered in connection with the devil. Fear was both weapon and shield. Authorities could use it to control, to accuse, to punish, to remind the people that only through obedience could safety be found. At the same time, it was a shield for the killers themselves. As long as people believed in wolves or witches, they did not look too closely at the man next door, and so fear spread like smoke. It blurred the truth, hid the killers, and allowed them to thrive. But fear did more than hide them. It magnified them. When Gilles de Rais fell, it was not only as a murderer of children. He was seen as a knight-turned-demon, proof that the devil walked in castles. When Peter Stump was executed, his crimes were not remembered as the madness of one man, but as the savagery of a werewolf, haunting the fields for generations. When Elizabeth B. Thory was confined to her castle, she was not merely a cruel noblewoman, but a vampire bathing in blood. The killers became more than human. They became symbols. They carried the weight of a society desperate to explain the unexplainable, desperate to make sense of cruelty too vast to face as human. But what of those who lived beside them before their names were revealed? What was it to walk in their world, to share their air, to trust them with your child or your bread? That was the heaviest fear of all, the fear that you could never truly know. For the people of the Middle Ages, killers were not strangers lurking at the edges of maps. They were part of life. They were the neighbor in the market, the noble in the castle, the beggar on the roadside, and so every step outside the door carried with it the weight of suspicion. The chroniclers wrote of miracles, of saints, of battles. But between the lines, in the spaces unspoken, lies this shadow. A shadow of fear that shaped not only how people lived, but how they imagined the world itself. Fear carved their stories into legends. Fear turned men into werewolves, women into vampires, and criminals into demons. Fear made killers larger than life, because only by turning them into monsters could people bear to remember them. And in that transformation lies the truth of medieval society. That fear was both their curse and their comfort. It kept them awake at night, but it also gave them an answer, however terrible, to the question that haunted them. Why do people die? Again and again, in the same cruel way. And the answer they gave, whispered from pulpits and across hearths, was this: because the devil walks among us. It was a simple answer. It was a wrong answer. But in a world too dark to know the truth, it was enough. The killers of the Middle Ages were many things. They were nobles and peasants, soldiers and healers, mothers and fathers. Some were real, their crimes carved into parchment and testified by trembling voices. Others became myths, their deeds transformed by fear into legends of wolves, witches, and vampires. But all of them remind us of the same truth, that cruelty does not belong to monsters alone. It belongs to people. In a world without light, without order, without protection, the line between human and beast was thin. A man could vanish into the forest and return a murderer. A noblewoman could lure children into her halls and become a legend of blood. A farmer could be branded a werewolf. A healer could be condemned as a poisoner. And whether they were guilty or innocent, their names entered history as shadows. For the Middle Ages were haunted not only by hunger and plague, but by the certainty that death could come at any time, from any hand. It was a world where danger did not always announce itself with swords or flames. Sometimes it whispered in silence. Sometimes it smiled across a dinner table. Sometimes it held your child's hand and promised safety. And that is why these stories endure, not because we believe in werewolves or witches, but because we know that the darkness of the human heart is older than memory. Because we understand, in some hidden place, that the monsters of legend were born from the actions of men and women who walk this earth as we do. To imagine the terror of those who lived then is to imagine a world where trust was fragile, where neighbors might turn against you, where silence could kill as easily as a blade, where justice came slowly or not at all. The chronicles preserve the names of kings and saints, but behind them lie the forgotten victims, the children of Gilles de Rice, the villagers of Bedburg, the peasants who vanished at the gates of Set Castle. Their names are not written, but their absence is. Their silence is the foundation on which these legends stand. And so, when we speak of the Middle Ages, we must remember not only the towers and banners, the knights and cathedrals, but also the shadows between them. The roads where bandits waited, the chambers where poison brewed, the castles where promises turned to blood. For history is not only the story of greatness, it is also the story of fear. And in that fear, in that silence, the killers of the Middle Ages found their power. As you close your eyes tonight, let these echoes fade softly into the dark. Let the weight of centuries drift away. Let the voices of the past quiet until only silence remains. And remember this, the monsters of the Middle Ages were not wolves, nor demons, nor witches. They were men and women, clothed in flesh, bound by hunger, driven by fear. They lived as others lived, and yet they killed again and again. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all, that the line between man and monster has never been sharp. That it is not drawn by fur or fang, but by choice. And that, in every age, there have been those who crossed it. Now the night is quiet. The fire is lowered. The killers of the Middle Ages sleep in their graves, their stories fading into history. And you, too, may rest, for the shadows of the past can do no harm here. Not anymore.